a beautiful group of literature lovers we have tonight. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Welcome. My name's Brianne Sanchez. I'm board president of the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. The library has been hosting AViD since 2001, and we are thrilled you are here, and that Joyce Carol Oates is here, let's be honest, right? The Des Moines Public Library Foundation is honored to support library programs like AViD each year, and I would like to thank our donors who make AViD possible. possible. Prairie Meadows, Nationwide Foundation, Brad and Kelly Edmister, Karen Schaff and Stephen Jane, Pamela Bass Bookie and Harry Bookie, Humanities Iowa, a state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation, Shelley and Martin Brody, Deborah and Douglas West, Dory Briles, Judy Blank, Jan Freed and John Fisher, Rachel Stauffer and Jim Lawson, and Dawn Taylor. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Offering outstanding authors for AViD free programs, the latest technology, and new initiatives takes more money than our tax dollars can provide. Please help us continue to make a difference with your gift to the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. You can find donation envelopes outside the doors at our table, or, this is really fun and I have a prop, we are doing this bookmark DMPL yard sign campaign. So for $20, you can get this lovely yard sign and you don't have to worry about putting any political candidate out there. You just write in a recommended read, and your neighbors might get the idea, you know. So maybe Butcher will be on several of these after tonight. But very exciting, just $20, and you'll be able to pick those up at your local favorite branch. A few more details, bear with me. Please complete an evaluation form. I think you'll probably have found it on your seat, and turn that in at the information table, or complete it online, or like while you're in line for the book signing. That's a good time to do it. These evaluations, the grant makers really love to see that feedback. So if you can't give $1, give some good feedback, and we can help keep bringing amazing authors back to Des Moines. Secondly, please, if you would like, purchase a book from Beaverdale Books and have your book autographed by the author. 10% of sales are donated to the foundation. So thank you, Beaverdale Books. All right, it's now my honor to provide the introduction to the introduction. So, our moderator tonight is one of my favorite voices, I think many of our favorite voices in Iowa, Charity Nebbe. For the past 14 years, Charity Nebbe has been helping Iowans tell their stories as host of interview program Talk of Iowa on Iowa Public Radio. She's also spent 10 years helping to shine a light on Iowa's food producers and chefs as host of the Iowa PBS program Iowa Ingredient. A native of Iowa, Charity lives with her family in Iowa City. Please welcome Charity Nebbe.
I'm going to start up here. All right. And first of all, I want to say thank you for tearing yourselves away from your cable news television stations this evening. It's wonderful that you're here. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar voices or familiar faces in the audience tonight. If I stood up here and I tried to tell you about all of the accomplishments of and the accolades received by Joyce Carol Oates, I would be up here all night. And I know that you came here to hear from Joyce, so I will just say a few things, and you probably know some of them. Joyce Carol Oates won the National Book Award in 1970 for her novel Them. She's been a finalist for the National Book Award many times. She is a 5-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She is the recipient of the National Humanities Medal and many, many other national and international awards. She has written and published more than 60 novels, many of them now considered to be classics. She has published 47 short story collections, and I'm not even going to attempt to put a number on the essays, the essay collections, the poetry, the books for children. She's also had a distinguished career as a teacher, retiring sort of from Princeton in 2014, but she still teaches a little bit. She is now 85 years old and showing no signs of slowing down. She has just released her latest novel, and I see it in many, many laps here tonight. Who's already read Butcher? Oh, that's impressive, because it's only been out for about a week. Butcher is inspired by history, and it follows the career of the fictional Dr. Silas Weir, who became known as the father of gyno-psychiatry. He practiced and experimented on the inmates of the New Jersey Asylum for Female Lunatics starting in the 1850s. And while the doctor and the women in this novel may be fictional, the story that inspired them and the history that inspired them is all too real. So we are going to dig into our conversation in a moment, but I do want to say one more thank you to the Des Moines Public Library, to the AViD series, and all of the sponsors who've made this evening possible. It is my great, great honor to welcome Joyce Carol Oates. We're going to get comfortable here. Let's make sure John Pemble is going to sneak up here and adjust your microphone, Joyce, before we really get started. Yes, this is John Pemble of Iowa Public Radio. Thank you, John. Oopsie. Will those photos appear on Twitter? Likely, on all likelihood. Joyce Carol Oates, thank you so much for coming to Des Moines and for being so generous with your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was just thrilling to hear the introduction. And I've only been here about 24 hours, but it's just such a wonderful place. I'm so impressed with your art center, I think it's called. Yeah.
And we ordered good weather just for you. We haven't had a lot of that lately, but. Yeah. So I want to start off by talking about Butcher. And I know that, so much of the medical history that inspired this novel is true, is real. I'm wondering, what was your inspiration for writing this?
Well, I suppose it's kind of complicated. My second husband, Charlie Gross, who passed away in 2019, was a neuroscientist. He was a research scientist and also a historian of medical history. So I was looking at some books of his, and I got very interested in the history of American medical misconduct, you might call it, or malpractice. The history of medicine itself is sort of a history of malpractice, actually. I mean, it's not just American, but sort of going back to Aristotle, actually. There are a number of references to Aristotle and the classical theoreticians about particularly how to treat women. And the novel is sort of riddled or laced with that medical history, what we see in the 21st century as mistaken, at the same time as sort of subterranean way some of the bias is still with us. That the male is like the mainstream, the norm, and then the women and even children were sort of aberrant, kind of ancillary. And if there's something wrong with a woman, it's probably because of her reproductive organs. So they were always eager to take them out. And this is, there are many things in my novel that people would say, oh no, that could never happen. It was actually worse. It was worse in real life.
Yeah, well, it's hard to imagine it being a lot worse than it is in this novel. There are some tough moments.
Well,
trust
for
me.
instance, in the first, the second chapter, I think it is, when Dr. Weir is trying to correct the skull of the infant, that's based upon J. Marion Sims's actual experiment when he was a young doctor. But it wasn't just one infant, it was 2 infants.
Oh,
So in original chapter or draft, I actually had 2 infants. And one of my editor and my agent said, you know, really, he said, he was so shaken by reading this one thing. He was a father of some young children. He said, maybe one example is enough. So that's a good example of how I had to actually tamp down and not include the full horror.
well, I know that Dr. Silas Weir was inspired by a number of real doctors, although I feel like real doctor is an overstatement. I mean, his education was almost non-existent.
That was right. Yeah, that was true. The character in the novel is a composite, and he's based upon 3 distinguished and renowned physicians of the 19th century. I mean, I didn't want to write about a person who was just a failure. Actually, these are very successful people. That was really the whole point. And they didn't think that they were butchers or doing anything wrong. They thought that they were doing a lot of good. And oddly enough, they all did some good. That's what's so ambiguous about the whole history of medicine, because it is experimental. Some of the experiments are just abhorrent and horrific, and yet it's like with animal experimentation, without animals being experimented upon, 20th century medicine, 21st century medicine basically wouldn't exist, you know. So we sort of owe so much to people in the past, even the ones who made mistakes and who were morally very questionable. Nonetheless, they were part of this sort of scientific experimentation that becomes very passionate in the 19th century.
Well, and this doctor he lacked in empathy, I would say, but so much of his worldview and the abhorrent things that he did to the women who were supposedly in his care, those things were shaped by the culture that he was part of, this very strong patriarchal culture, but also this class system that was so strong, because not only is he disgusted by women, but he feels like women of a lower class are disposable.
Yes, it's very much a class system. But what interested me about it is that both sexes, especially in the 19th century, were taught to feel great shame about their bodies. And it seems hard to believe today, but a woman who was pregnant could not really talk about her pregnancy. I suppose she might with her mother or somebody very intimate to her, but it couldn't be alluded to. And even the husband, you'd have to tell the husband in some circumlocucious way, because it was considered just very vulgar. And you probably remember in a novel, later on in the novel, near the end of the career, that cancer was a word that was not uttered, that was considered obscene. And anything to do with women's bodies, like a uterine cancer or breast cancer, you could never say that. That was so taboo. Today, we're so open and in a good, really healthy way about all these things, and yet our ancestors were completely, they were just completely confined in some odd way. So there was a women's hospital in New York City. It was actually founded by Miriam Sims, and I think I put some of that in my novel too. But he wanted to treat women with cancer, but the board, the trustees wouldn't allow it. They said, no, we can't have women with cancer in our hospital. They were considered just like almost like lepers. Isn't that weird? Yeah. I
Well,
was,
and it wasn't really left behind in the 19th century either. I mean, you think about when Betty Ford had breast
Yeah.
cancer, it was groundbreaking that she was public about the fact that she had breast cancer. This continued on well into the 20th
That's
century.
true, that's true. I guess I was, when I was doing the research, I was continually surprised by many things. I do a good deal of research for many of my novels, and I'm always surprised at some of the things that I come upon that, you sort of shake your head.
Well, one of my favorite things about many of your novels, but there are so many moments in this one that are so beautiful. You have these almost sly little details that are so telling. And one of my favorite details, and it's not a big spoiler, but one of my favorite details in this novel is that Dr. Weir has gotten married and he has impregnated his wife, but he is unaware that she's pregnant. His father-in-law is actually the one who tells him that his wife is pregnant. So here is a medical doctor who does not suspect.
Yeah. Well, doing the research into medicine in the 19th century was very revealing. I mean, probably everybody knows that the first thing they always did was bleed you, even if you were anemic. I guess if you had
If you were
tuberculosis,
hemorrhaging, right?
tuberculosis, but they wouldn't really know how to do anything else. So when in doubt, bleed. So anything you came in with, anything, they would bleed you to begin with. And then sometimes people died, but nobody questioned the doctor because it was considered it was his time, that God or fate or whatever had to do with that. So it was his time. And they never apologized for anything because they didn't think that they were doing anything wrong.
Well, so we've talked a lot about Dr. Weir so far, and he works his way up through the medical establishment, although this big opportunity comes to him when he becomes the director of this asylum. But my favorite character in the book is the first person that he encounters at the asylum, and her name is Gretel. And she is a midwife, and she has called, they have called Dr. Weir to come because there is a young woman who is giving birth and in great distress, and it is likely that she will die or the baby will die, and so they've asked him to come in, and the first person he encounters is this midwife who shows herself time and time again to know so much more than he does.
Absolutely. The midwives did everything.
Yeah.
The doctors.
And they weren't afraid to look at women, for one thing.
Well, without midwives, I don't think people would have had any babies. I mean, really, they did everything. But they were at the same time looked down upon. So if something went wrong in the delivery, then it was the midwife's fault.
And we also learned very quickly that the woman who is pregnant, we get to know her very well, but she's a young woman. Is she 12 or 14 when she's giving birth in
No,
this?
she's about 16.
Okay, 16 years old. And it's very clear that she's been raped and impregnated by someone who works in this asylum. And of course, that's her fault as well.
Yes, you always blame the victim. But I should say that part of the novel is set not far away from where I live. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, and the asylum for lunatics was in Trenton, the state asylum, New Jersey State Asylum. It's shut down now. It did some awful things were done there, but yet the idea was not that wrong. It was Dr. Weir's idea, and it was Dr. Henry Cotton is the person I base this on. His idea was that mental illness is caused by infection. And he was basing that idea on the fact that syphilis was, third stage of syphilis would cause insanity. So it wasn't that he was wrong, he just was not completely right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of medical history is almost like an exploration of how people went in this direction and that was wrong. They went in this direction, that turned out to be right. But when they started out, it wasn't that evident. And because I was married to Charlie Gross, who was a research scientist, all research scientists will tell you that's how it is. You start back here and you do something and it turns out to be right. But somebody else at another university is spending 20 years of his life, going in the wrong direction. It doesn't really mean that anyone was ignorant. It was almost like fate. So it turned out that syphilis does cause madness, but his other ideas that infected teeth cause madness, that turned out to be wrong.
Right, but he pulled a lot of teeth.
He pulled, yeah. In real life, it was said that in Trenton, if you drove along the city street in Trenton, you would see all these people who were sort of, they were very poor people because it was a state hospital. You'd see, there would be people on the street and none of them had any teeth. Their mouths were all very sunken, and they were Henry Cotton's victims. He pulled everybody's teeth. So if you came in with like a mild neurosis, say you had OCD, which is undergraduates' favorite neurosis, I think, where they, that sort of obsessive compulsive, is that the mental problem of our time? It's relatively harmless, I think. But say you had that, then Dr. Weir or Dr. Cotton would say, well, we're going to start by pulling out all your teeth. The idea is like, well, there's nothing wrong with my teeth, but they might be infected like that. Or if you're a woman, they take out your uterus. Like there's nothing wrong with the uterus, but it is a uterus.
Right.
So let's kind of,
Something wrong fundamentally.
Get rid of that.
Well, and it's important to point out that, I mean, he's trying to treat mental illness through these procedures that he's doing, and the word for hysterectomy is very closely related to the word for hysteria.
Hysteria.
So we know that idea went back a long, long way.
Yes, and men couldn't become hysterical. Men just were more manly. Like a man gets angry or loses his temper, that's a manly thing, but a woman gets hysterical.
So I want to ask about the inspiration for the character Bridget, who is the woman that we see giving birth at first, and then we get to know her much better throughout the book. And she is an orphan. She is Irish American, but she is being kept as an indentured servant at the asylum. And Dr. Weir becomes fascinated with her very quickly. Obviously, other members of the staff had been quite taken with her as well, but she's experienced a great deal of trauma in her life, and the trauma of losing her mother left her mute and deaf. And she's referred to as an albino, although she doesn't have red eyes, so I think that she's just extraordinarily pale. Where did Bridget come from?
Well, let's see, Bridget's kind of a complicated composite because she's based on the main subject of J. Marion Sims's experimentation, who was a black slave girl. He operated on her without any anesthesia about 30 times. It's quite remarkable. There's actually a whole book about her. And then she is sort of based on my idea of my own ancestors who are Irish, who came to the United States in the 19th century, and they were probably indentured servants. I say probably because most Irish people who came here were very poor. That's why they left Ireland. They were very poor, and the only way you could get here would be to be an indentured servant. So I did research into that, and I was so fascinated. I was looking at these actual contracts. You wouldn't believe it. A man, the father, women didn't have any legal rights, but a father could sell a baby, like a 6-month baby. He could sell his own baby as an indentured servant till the age of 21. Isn't that astonishing? I mean, I was just amazed. I include one of the contracts in the novel, and I was just fascinated. I was looking at this. I can do the research online, fortunately. Some of this material is at the Harvard Library. And I was so amazed. I didn't know that. So I'm just assuming that my Irish ancestors probably came over that way. What happened was that Ireland was very poor, and so that if you had, say, 7 or 8 or 9 children, you sort of thought, well, I'll sell some of them, and you would make some arrangement with somebody in the United States to take on the indentured servant. then the passage for the ship was paid for. But then the person was stuck, and so you're supposed to be released when you're 21, but if something went wrong, like we were sick, and you couldn't work all the time, or you broke a leg, I mean, your master could just keep pushing that along. And it wasn't as bad as chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means that they really own you forever, and they own your children. Indentured servants didn't sell their children. The children were theirs. But the women were and the girls, mostly everybody was very young in those days. People didn't live much beyond 40 or so. But a girl who's 13 or 14 would already probably be impregnated or sexually abused. By 16, she'd be maybe married and have babies. So a lot of these young girls, Irish girls, worked in New York City. They did any kind of manual labor. They were maids, they were housemaids, and they worked in hospitals. They were sort of like slaves. And they slept all together, like in the basement. They didn't have really good sleeping arrangements. And so the reading about indentured servants, which I consider probably my own background way back, that was really illuminating. I think less is known about indentured servitude than about slavery, as many of our ancestors were indentured servants, but we don't know much about it.
Well, and not only do you illuminate the powerlessness of these indentured servants, but you also explore the deep hypocrisy of abolitionists who have no trouble having indentured servants. So there are people who say that they are anti-slavery, but they certainly like having people who work for them who they don't have to pay.
Exactly. But the novel does have a happy ending.
Spoiler alert. Well, and also Dr. Weir makes a tremendous medical discovery that is still benefiting women today.
Yes, that's right, he did.
And it just strikes me what an alternate history would look like.
I know.
Because here, yes, he's the butcher. We don't like him very much, but if you wrote that history different, he's the hero.
Well, that's what's so strange and ironic about medical history. I am a great cat lover, and I know you are a dog lover. I mean, many of us are animal lovers, but many of us, probably almost everyone in the room, might not even be alive if it weren't for the real suffering of animals and experimentations that began in the 19th century. If you go in a hospital with third-degree burns, you're going to be treated in a way to save you, but that's because chimpanzees and others had to suffer horribly. Not to mention cats and even dogs. Chimpanzees are so close to being human. All primates are sort of really close, and so primate experimentation was very prevalent. I think it's outlawed now. Some things are done with monkeys that are not invasive. The experiments with animals now are not really invasive. But up until the 1960s, 1970s, maybe even today, there was neuroscientific experiments done with brains of monkeys because they're so much like our brains. Treating blindness and also treating strokes, treating cancers. Animals were injected with cancerous cells so that tumors would develop and then they would be operated on. So anyone in the room who's had any kind of surgery like that, it's because animals did suffer. And we would say in our alternative universe, if that hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't even be here. I mean, I know my parents, like in the latter half of their lives, they were, kept relatively healthy by all sorts of medical technology. I think the University of Iowa is one of the great centers, isn't it, for all sorts of new medical technology.
That's true.
And astonishing things, like almost every day there's some new breakthrough. So I'm not at all anti-science, but I think, as you were saying, Charity, it's just the mixed quality of it that makes us really I think, aware of the profound ironies of life.
We're going to talk a little bit about your writing process now, and as we transition away from focusing on this novel, I think everybody had an index card on their chair, so if you want to write a question for Joyce Carol Oates, please write your question on that card. You can get more cards if you raise your hand, or if you have a question, we'll pick it up, and we'll work those into the conversation throughout the evening. So in this novel, Joyce, you write in so many different voices because Dr. Silas Weir tells his story, his son Jonathan tells some of his father's story and his own story, and Bridget, this young woman who has suffered so much, she tells her story as well. So you had the opportunity to get into each one of these voices. Is that an act of empathy for you? Do you become these characters?
Oh, yes. Well, we all have different voices, and it's quite natural that the son of a distinguished father who can't stand his father, it's natural that he would have a certain tone about the father. He does admire him in a way, but he's also pretty sarcastic, and it's just sort of natural. And then Bridget is, maybe I consider her in the tradition of some of the Black women narrative writers. Phyllis Wheatley, one of the great Black poets, women poets, they were extremely gifted, but they were illiterate to begin with, so they had to be taught. They were taught, and they picked up reading, and basically they learned how to write. And so Bridget is in that tradition. There was a publisher in Philadelphia. It's in a novel. I don't remember the name of the publisher right now, but it is in a novel. This publisher was really avant-garde and was an abolitionist, and they would publish slave narratives and women's writing that was sort of like taboo. It was sort of like the back channel of narrative.
Right, well, and it was a double taboo to
Double
be
taboo.
A Black woman in our culture as well.
Yeah.
So you write Silas Weir so well, and the language is antiquated, and his style is so pompous. What does it take for you to be able to write in that voice?
Oh, it wasn't hard at all. Like, I remember, it's sort of appealing. He's just so clueless. Like at one point, he's going to do this surgery. He wants to correct cleft palates. He wants to correct club feet, and he wants to correct like a misshapen skull. So these are all medical problems that eventually were corrected, you know. He didn't have the wrong idea, really, for anything. Even the infant skull, that wasn't a wrong idea. He didn't know how to execute it. He actually had the right idea, but he didn't have the right experience. He didn't have the right tools. So he wants to correct cleft palates. There seem to be much more of these deformities in the past than there are now. It may be that when a baby is born, maybe they're corrected right away, right in the hospital, you know, right then. We never see this, but a lot of people were deformed in different ways. So he sees that this woman has this cleft and her mouth is misshapen. So he's going to correct it. And he's got some surgical tools that he bought secondhand, and he's kind of excited about this. The woman's tied down. But fortunately, he has two women, Greta and Bridget, who are helping him, because the women always know more than he does. So they're kind of helping and giving him little hints about things to do. And he realizes, comes over him in a feeling of sensation of cold. I don't know what I'm doing. He just suddenly realized he actually doesn't know what he's doing, but then he thinks, I have to do it. Like, how many doctors and surgeons really have felt that way? They didn't really, confronted with the actual person, they didn't quite know what they were going to do. Now, they planned something like the night before, you know, but then when they see this person, And they didn't have any practice with surgery. He didn't have any practice. So then he starts to examine the inside of her mouth, and it turns out to be much more misshapen than he thought, because he had never thought to that moment of looking inside her mouth. I mean, there are many doctors who just don't, they just don't seem to think about these things. They feel that they know everything. So then he does something, he sort of fixes her up, and he stitches her in, and he keeps checking, and the women, Greta and Bridget, are sort of taking care of the patient who's all got bandages. Then finally they take the bandage off at the end, and he is so hurt. He is very hurt that he hasn't gotten any praise from his nurse assistants. They haven't said how well he stitched it up. And I just thought that would be so typical. Like, he's completely maimed this woman. Now she looks much worse. The misshapen, the cleft is worse now because he just cut it wrong and he didn't do it right. But he just feels hurt that he didn't get credit for the stitching, which he thought was quite good. And I just thought that's just how he would be. Well, there are many men where you have to take care of their egos, Yeah. And I mean, I exempt all the men in this room. I don't mean men here. But there are many women who will say that the one primary duty of the wife is actually to protect the fragile ego of the male.
Well, I mean,
but not talk about it.
He is shaped by his culture.
Yes,
and
yeah.
very much so, and many men and women have been shaped and continue to be shaped by our culture. And
Absolutely. Like the whole idea of emasculation, that very phenomenon, there is nothing analogous with women. And like the idea of emasculation is just so humiliating and eviscerating. The man has to be like a hyper man, but nobody will say to a woman, be a woman. They say, be a man, And that imperative, I would think, is extremely paralyzing and, overwhelming.
we're probably not going to solve these,
Right.
right, all of our gender issues in our culture right now. But let's talk about research instead. And we have a question from the audience that anticipated one of my questions. And they want to know, do you research as you're writing, or do you do the research before you start writing? And either way, when do you know you're done with research?
Well, John Updike once said the research is the innocent part of writing. And so you're just reading and having fun. When I researched my novel, Blonde, about Norma Jean Baker, who becomes Marilyn Monroe, I had a wonderful time. I saw all of Marilyn Monroe's movies that I could see in the chronological order. So I was basically watching them, taking lots of notes, kind of imagining what the young actress was thinking and what she was doing in the scenes. A lot of that was left out of the novel because the novel got too long. But every movie that she was in that I featured in my novel, that was very, very carefully thought out because I watched it. Like the young Marilyn Monroe does certain things before she becomes the famous Marilyn Monroe. Her early movies, she was more like a regular actress. She was a serious young actress. And then with Niagara, and particularly with Gentlemen Prefer Blonde, she became this kind of iconic figure. And she never really got over that. But before that, she was an actress, and she was doing things that actresses are doing, and she was learning. So I had a really good time with that. And I have researched a number of novels that take place in the 19th century. That's the century that I'm particularly interested in. Then with this, of course, some of the research, just the area is right near my house. I've seen photographs of the lunatic asylum. It sounds bizarre that something would be called a lunatic asylum, but it was. That was the name of it. The word lunatic was not considered a bad word. Female lunatics was pretty extreme, but the asylum for female lunatics, there were poor houses. They were called poor houses. Like somebody's grandmother was at the poor house. It was just words were used differently.
Let's talk about your writing process. So you are so prolific. You have written so many novels, and I know that you write, at least I've read that you write longhand. Do you still write longhand?
The first draft.
The first draft. So can you describe once you have completed your research and you are writing a novel, what is your routine? How do you do it?
Well, a lot of my writing takes place in my head before I sit down to write. So I do a lot of walking. I walk every day as long as I can, really. I run. I don't run as much as I used to, but running and walking are part of my writing, actually. So I think about what I'm going to do. It's sort of like daydreaming with your eyes open and meditating and sort of working out. Like if you go out walking and running for 1 hour, that's about long enough to go through a whole short story or a chapter. That is, you sort of see the movie in your mind. You kind of work through it. Say something is going to be 20 pages, probably about 1 hour, you can do that. Then coming back, you write down rapidly what you did, what you remember. Just you write it down very quickly so that I have some notes from it. So then I do a lot of writing in longhand, and that to me also is easy because it's my handwriting and it's mine. But then when I move to the computer, I start typing, it gets much more formal and it's not as flexible. The flexibility is in the handwriting. If there are any poets in the audience, you probably write in your handwriting as a poet because poetry is so intimate and so immediately coming from the unconscious that you really want just your own handwriting. I think somebody said that Billy Collins had been here.
Yeah.
Had he been here? Yeah. Billy Collins, I'm sure, writes in hand. And I write in hand because it comes more directly from the unconscious.
You have also frequently said that 95% of your writing process is in revision. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, the revising is so exciting. I really love that. After I've taken the notes kind of rapidly in longhand, then I put it on the computer, but it sort of turns out like a really, really detailed long outline. So I have the ending. I always have the ending, and I'll have some scenes in the middle. John Updike said that he began writing a novel with the climactic dramatic scene. So I do that also. Now in my novel, the climactic scene basically comes like 70 pages in. It's the scene where all the women rise up against Dr. Weir. They rise up and they do horrible things to him. Every part of his body, each one of them has a special interest in some part of his body. Even one of them, a person who died some years ago, she sort of comes back, a young girl that he butchered. He didn't mean to do it, of course, but they sort of all come back. That was like the idea for the novel, is that scene. And so that's actually at the beginning of the novel. It's the first, it's the prologue. So if you read that prologue, that's the climax of the novel. So the reader would read that and then go back in time to the beginning, and then you're moving up, and then you get to that point. But then you go on for another 70 pages or so. Most of my novels end with the younger generation kind of rising up. And the older generation has had some tragic experiences and they may not survive. But the younger generation is coming along, and at the time of this novel, like 1850, 1860, around that time, the younger people were more likely to be abolitionists. It's like during the Vietnam War, the younger people were likely to be anti-Vietnam War, and the older generation was more likely to be conservative. So that's just the way life is. So I feel that ending with the girl being actually a published poet, she's able to go into the world independently of having anyone taking care of her. And then, but we do feel that they're going to get together at the end. Did you feel that? Yes.
You still want to read it, okay?
Well, I believe in romance. I believe in tragedy, and I think that in large political, larger context, that life is quite tragic. There's always war and violence and hurtfulness, but in human, smaller relationships, like within families or male-female or male-male or same-sex marriage or anything that's sort of emotional ties. I'm very optimistic about that. I do believe in romance. So for me, it's not anything out of stretch to put a romantic ending in a novel if it's just basically plausible. You know, you wouldn't have a happy ending for the whole country because that's not going to ever happen. But for 2 people or 3 people, like a family, that can end well.
And I so appreciate that you're willing to have an uplifting ending, because I
yeah.
do feel that some authors just won't.
Well, I believe in like animal rights. You know, you have 8 cats.
Yeah.
8 cats. I have only 2 cats. But anybody who has 8 cats is so romantic-minded. Plus, very adorable dogs.
Yeah.
I mean, like, oh, you know, like soft-hearted people. At the same time, you're probably quite hard-headed about history. I mean, you're not, it doesn't mean that you're sentimental about history. It just means that you have you know, like the emotional, like your domestic life is under your control.
Suddenly I feel examined. This is another audience question. How have you arrived at such a deep understanding of the darkest recesses of the human psyche? Because you do go deep and dark in many of your novels.
Well, I would say, sort of parenthetically, that if you read any novel of mine, no cat or dog will be harmed. So even though I may have
A baby died.
well, that's true, but it wasn't a kitten. Well, the baby, that's actually happened. I mean,
Yeah.
that's from real life.
Yeah.
I was reading J. Marion Sims's autobiography, and you can access it through the Harvard Library, and he talks about these things himself. And the fact that one of his patients, any of his patients died, he was very, very upset by that, because it seemed to be that God was punishing him, that there was something went wrong. Like, how could one of my patients die? His vanity was just so overwhelming. He didn't feel sorry for the patient. He was just sort of, his pride was hurt. He was just so chagrined that his patient died.
Back to those dark recesses, though, I often feel like your work shines a light into those dark recesses.
Yes.
Do you feel that way?
Oh, yes, definitely. And my women characters, women and girls who suffer sometimes at the hands of men, nonetheless, I'm sort of focusing on how they come through it and how they persevere. And Bridget has had a lot of things happen to her physically that she couldn't control. She feels shamed by it, but then later on, she sort of becomes just much more self-reliant. But it's along with her being very literate. She learns how to read, and she learns how to write. So the act of learning language for women is a way of empowering language. As initially, language was mostly for men, and men were mostly educated, and women were often not educated. So being educated, being able to write your own books, that sort of elevates you.
You've talked a lot about hope and looking to younger generations, even if that's a generation that is long gone. What gives you hope? Where do you find it in your life?
Well, literally that generation of abolitionists starting in New England and John Brown and that sort of wave of abolitionists in the 1840s, 1850s, they were fairly young. Henry David Thoreau was one of them. I mean, really, they were fairly young, and they won. It wasn't easy. I mean, the whole Civil War was a horrible catastrophe and horrible and bloody. So, and I think the generation of young people coming of age in the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War organizers who were fighting the draft, they were very idealistic. It's too bad that generation got sort of mixed up with drugs. I think they became so disappointed and so disillusioned with the election of Nixon. And as it turned out, Nixon would resign in a few years, but they didn't know that. It's like the 1970 was such a time of despair for young people. Young men had to face the draft. Young men who could be like 18 or 19 years old, and they didn't want to go out and kill anybody. They certainly didn't want to go to Vietnam and kill somebody, or be killed, or be maimed. So if you were alive at that time, it was such a fraught time. And so the optimism and idealism of that generation, I thought was very legitimate, very just. It's just that they became so disappointed. Then the draft was eliminated, and so that was because of the agitation of the young people. The activists, they had the fact that the consequence was the draft was eliminated.
You are teaching still, you're interacting with Gen Z students today. Does Gen Z give you hope?
I wonder what will follow Gen Z.
It's supposed to be Gen Alpha is
It's sort of
next. We're
run out of-
starting over.
We run out of letters.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my undergraduates, most of my undergraduates at Princeton, they're extremely idealistic. They work very hard. They write novels, they write book-length senior theses, they work extremely hard. I have a wide range of students. At Princeton, I have undergraduates, so they're quite young. Then I also sometimes I teach at Rutgers, a state university. And I have older students, and they have much more complicated lives. They could be married, they could have children, they have jobs, So they're a little different. But say the youngest students are idealistic in a kind of desperate way because of climate change and gun control, things high school age students are thinking about that require a lot of integrity and resilience. Older people have they think, have ruined the planet for them, and they have to sort of come along and do something.
This is a specific question about students. This person says, I love teaching Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been to community college literature students. What advice would you give for them reading it, or for me teaching it? And first, that's inspired by Bob Dylan, right? Am I misremembering this?
No,
okay.
It was inspired by a real life incident in Tucson, Arizona.
Okay.
In 1965 or something like that. I dedicated this story to Bob Dylan because a song of his that was very popular at the time seemed to have the same kind of theme. It's all over now, baby blue. But I dedicated it to Bob Dylan after I wrote the story. The story was originated by a real life serial killer in Tucson, Arizona. He was called the Pied Piper of Tucson. Journalists find these names for these kind of horrible people.
So any advice on teaching it to today's students?
Well, teachers are competent to interpret things for themselves. Maybe there's some teachers in the room.
Maybe.
The story is extremely clear. It starts off with the word Connie, where she was like 15 years old, and basically the whole story is about Connie, and it's pretty straightforward. So it is based on a Hawthornian idea of fiction, that fiction is symbolic and allegorical, but you don't have to know that to teach the story.
What keeps you teaching? Because you don't have to do that at this point in your life. What keeps you going back again and again?
Well, I really love teaching. Teaching is very social, and the students and I are reading texts together. We don't just read their work, we also read classic texts. We could spend an hour on a story by Hemingway, a story by Faulkner, James Joyce, Ray Carver, Toni Morrison. We look at things that are contemporary and analyze the fiction and the style and the prose, and then we look at their work. It's almost like half the class classic work, and then half the class is their work. So I just find it very, very enjoyable. It's like it's conversation with really inspired, committed people.
If you still have a question in your hand, raise it up and we'll get that last round of questions up here. This person wants to know if you have advice for women who want to write about taboo topics.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Well, there are a number of ways that women have addressed the subject. Some of them have written under pseudonyms. So that's the easiest way. Some of our greatest writers like George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, and Emily Bronte, they all wrote under pseudonyms. And A.S. Byatt, well, she wasn't hiding that she was a woman, but she used initials. So that's a possibility. Writing under a pseudonym, it depends how strong the taboo is, because if you publish under your own name, you can be sure that everyone in your family and everyone who knows you will read what you wrote and find themselves. And they will, and even your mother will. And even though you say, well, this person looks nothing like you and is a different sex and is a different age, they say, that's me. And no, I do, one of my women friends who's a writer, she wrote a novel basically about herself, her own experiences, but her mother found herself in it. She wouldn't speak to her for 7 years. And my friend was hurt. I mean, it was not laughing matter. She was really very hurt. Now that's bad enough, but when some of them find themselves, then they call a lawyer. That's really bad. They start to sue.
Has that happened to you?
That has not happened to me. Nobody's ever found themselves in my writing, because I really do make up characters. My characters might be composites. The people in Butcher are all dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of them died at about 1870, so there's no problem with that. But I think that women, more than most men, have a difficulty hurting people's feelings. You know, if you wrote an honest memoirist novel about your own life, there would be some things in it that would be painful to somebody, even though many better things are said about the same person. If you say 19 good things about someone and one little negative thing, it's like she always interrupts, you know, like, or some little thing like that. She throws her hands around when she talks. Some little trivial thing, they will be hurt by that and they ignore all the rest.
Before we run out of time, I do want to ask about your relationship with Twitter.
Oh, Twitter. Right.
Which I guess we should call X. But you have a strong following on Twitter. You share a lot on Twitter. And you seem to be unafraid of what kind of a reaction you might get on Twitter. Do you feel that's true?
Well, Twitter I think of as sort of like an ongoing stream. I consider, like, you all know the idea of like Zen consciousness.
I don't find Twitter Zen, but go on.
Well, the idea of Buddhism is that everything's passing away.
Yeah.
Life is basically a stream of transient, effervescent things that are momentarily engaging, but then they kind of pass away. So if you're looking to something permanent, that would be art, or an institution like a university or a library, you know, books. That tends to be cultural things, or the works of art that I saw today at the art collection, which are so wonderful. I mean, they're up on the wall. There's, you know, an Edward Hopper painting that he probably did in 1928. There it is. And all the newspaper gossip and everything of 1928, it's all gone, but that work is there. So basically, that's how I think of it. There are two kinds of time. One is ephemeral. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's like chattering on the telephone. People used to talk on the phone. I would talk with my women friends or my girlfriends when I was in school. It's all gone. I don't remember one thing I said as an adolescent. I mean, it's all completely gone. But yet, if I read Shakespeare during that time or did some writing, then that would be more permanent. So that's how I think of Twitter. I think it basically lets just all going away, but there are many, many animal videos on Twitter.
That's true.
Especially when things are looking dour and sad, people say, we need some kittens, and they put some cats on. And when things are really, really bad, then you see a lot of cross-species animals, like a warthog with a cat, or a fox mother nursing some piglets.
Yeah.
And it just warms people's heart. Have you seen them?
Oh yeah. There's a badger coyote friendship that's one of my favorites.
Badger coyote. See,
Yeah.
when things are really, really terribly tragic, then you reach for that.
We've talked about hope in this young generation and where you find hope, but we have seen a lot of really difficult and ugly things in recent years. Just one of them is the movement to ban books, which has really, really surged in the last 4 years. Watching that happen and gain so much political momentum, do you have wisdom to share with us about that movement?
Well, I think it's very sad because it has a complicated history. So banning books is just a wedge issue. You know, the people who want to ban books, they don't care about the books that much. I'm thinking the politicians who have a mandate to try to lower taxes. So you get a lot of wedge issues, like at one time they tried to make people hate same-sex marriage, and that didn't work out so well, so that's sort of been dropped. And they try to make you hate queer people or gay people or transgender people, and they try to make you hate some books, or they try to make you hate somebody else, you know. These are what we call wedge issues in politics. So banning books is sort of like a smokescreen issue, and yet for people who don't know that, they take it seriously. What we call cultural war, it's sort of like smokescreen, people waving flags. Like, I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but sometimes you see a politician who could care less about this issue. He's had no interest at all, but he's pretending to, trying to get people angry, trying to divide people. Women should be much more organized and unified than they are, but women have been made to be divided politically in this country. So banning books, it's sort of like it's like the tip of the iceberg, and there's something deeper beneath. We're in such a culture where there's so many very, very rich people who are largely invisible. Oligarchs are sort of invisible, and then there are many, many poor people and not so much of a middle class. And so that's where people's anger should be directed, not at books, but the books are something finite where you can sort of rouse up people emotionally. And this other issue about class is very hard to get a handle on, and many people just won't talk about it at all. You don't see much discussion. But banning books is something people can talk about.
We've talked about that ephemeral time, but let's talk about art and what we leave behind, because you are leaving, you are creating still, but when you go, you will leave this incredible body of work. And this member of the audience wants to know what you hope the impact of your writing is and will be on society.
Well, that's the kind of question I think writers can't really answer. I don't think anybody has a sense of what lies ahead. Whenever I look at a work of art, like anything by Vincent van Gogh, you know, he only made about $25 in his own lifetime, and now his paintings are selling for $250 million. He died in great despair. the last 70 days of his life, he painted 75 great works of art. He was just in a manic state. He could have had no idea. I mean, no idea. If you told Vincent van Gogh what his paintings would be selling for in 2024, he could not have believed you. It was overwhelming. Or Melville, who died a complete failure, he would not be able to believe that Moby Dick is considered our great novel. So there are a lot of people who think that they may have a legacy, and then it turns out that they don't. A lot of it is the vicissitudes of fate. And fortunately, I think we just can't think about that.
So much of your work, though, has held up for decades now and still feels incredibly relevant. I was 25 years old before I first read one of your novels, and the first novel of yours that I read was Them. And it was so powerful at that moment, just as powerful as I'm sure it was when it was published in 1969. So
Well,
you've already you've gotten to see some of your legacy.
Well, thank you, and just say a couple of words about that novel. That was my first novel that I ever wrote set in a large American city with all the problems that are with us today, like of race and class and so forth.
In Detroit, yeah.
In Detroit. But before that, I was writing stories and novels set like in the country, like rural upstate New York. So it was just an accident that I moved to Detroit. And if I hadn't moved to Detroit, I wouldn't be here right now. I'm very much aware of the alternative lives that we lead and how much of our lives are accidental. There are good accidents as well as bad accidents. You know, the fact that my husband at that time and I got teaching jobs together in Detroit, that was like an accident. We had 2 teaching jobs. We went to Detroit. And that steered my writing in a certain way, and then you read it, you know. But it was, I have to say, well, that was an accident.
Well, thanks for moving to Detroit. That was a great. Final question. What's next? What are you working on for your next project?
Well, my next project is the first time I have ever in my life written a whodunit. And I took the challenge very seriously. I have the structure, the mystery, all very carefully plotted, and it almost has like a classical structure because I've never done that before. I've written novels in which there might be a crime committed, but you usually know who did it, and you might not know why. But this is like a classical whodunit, and so you only know who actually did it, like in the last 10 pages. But it makes sense. It all works out. And my editor and a couple of people read it, said that they were surprised at the ending. So that was what I'm finishing up now.
All right. Well, we can't wait. Joyce Carol Oates, thank you so much.